Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome for a second time a very accomplished leader and author uh, from the US, Mr. James Kerr. Jim, welcome to the show.
Ashutosh, it's so great to be with you again.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the invitation.
Thank you. Jim is the founder of Indispensable Leadership Community. And in our last conversation, we did speak about indispensable leadership. He's also an author, and the author is titled The Indispensable Leaders Handbook: 101 Tips from a Top Ranked Business Coach. He has 6 parts in the book, and today we're going to talk about 5 of those parts. He's a business coach, and he has written 6 books earlier. So, Jim, let's get straight into the subject. Tell me a little bit about your book, The Indispensable Leaders Handbook. And before you answer, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. James Kerr's book on Amazon and other platforms. I'm going to do the same. Tell me a little bit about, yeah, there's the book. Wonderful. So, tell me about the book and what was the motivation or the hypothesis when you wrote it?
Sure, yeah. The book contains 101 leadership tips. It comes from decades of doing leadership coaching and management consulting. And I thought it was time to capture this before I lost all of the thinking that went into these
Mhm.
tips. So I used the book as a vehicle to capture those ideas and to get it across, through the written word.
Mhm. So, you talk about 6 different segments, and I've got 5 of them here, and maybe you can remind me of the sixth. You got leadership mindset tips, strategic vision tips, company culture tips, trust and empowerment tips, change management tips, and one more. Um,
And the last one is on people. So
okay.
it's people centered.
Oh,
But
thank you.
I love the five that you remember because they're all about people too.
Yep, absolutely right. So we're going to talk about each of these. We won't have that much time to go into tremendous amount of depth and all, but since it is 101 tips, and I've asked all of you to go and check out Jim's book, let's start with leadership mindset tips. What are some of the key attributes of a successful leadership mindset according to your book?
Well, it starts with, and this is tip number one, leadership is a choice.
Hmm.
So that's a really critical mindset principle that all leaders should adopt and embrace because after all, you have to choose to lead. It's not about your title. It's not about where you sit in the org chart. It's
Hmm.
about, deciding that you're going to engage and inspire people so that they deliver,
Hmm.
their best effort.
Hmm. Well said. And what tips would you provide for leaders to enhance their own self awareness?
Tip number one is get a coach.
Hmm.
If you really, I mean, in order for us to become better aware of how we're projecting ourselves and bringing ourselves to the workplace every day,
Hmm.
uh, it really does help to have an objective third party whose only reason for having a conversation with you is to help you become a better leader.
Hmm.
They can provide some really good perspective and help expose some of the blind spots you might have
Yeah.
without having that objective third party,
Hmm.
helping you. So yeah,
Absolutely.
get a coach.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. The importance of a coach in a leadership journey can be underscored at all. And my third question on leadership mindset tips is, can you talk a little bit about how a fixed versus a growth mindset can impact leadership effectiveness?
Sure. I mean, I think it's critical for leaders to have a growth mindset simply because if you don't, you're closing yourself off to the possibilities. So the growth mindset is the thing that's going to help you recognize that there are other ways to do things. There are opportunities that are just around the corner and keep you open to learning.
Mhm.
If it's a fixed mindset, then you walk in the door and you think you've got all the answers,
Mm.
and you're limiting yourself.
Yeah, yeah, well said. So let's now talk about strategic vision tips. What are the core components of a strong strategic vision as per your book?
It really begins with a story.
Hmm.
The best way to provide a vision, it's not a statement that you put on the back of a business card or something you can hang on a banner. It really has to be a story that engages, that informs, it gets people to see how they can be successful by helping the leadership pursue and achieve its vision.
Mhm.
So you gotta start off with a compelling story.
Hmm. And what are some common challenges leaders face when they're faced with developing a strategic vision? And how can some of these challenges be overcome?
I think perhaps the biggest challenge that I've seen in industry, and again, I've been practicing for decades and I've helped dozens of companies develop vision stories. I think the biggest challenge is overcoming the resistance to actually take action.
Okay.
So w without action, your vision is fantasy.
Hmm.
So if you really want to achieve your vision, you've got to then pursue it. You've got to put
Hmm.
resources behind it and execute and make choices and decisions along the way based on what that vision is all
Hmm.
about.
And would you have any interesting example of how, any one of these challenges was faced and overcome by a leader? And I don't want any names, of course.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key elements of a successful leadership team, one that really creates the vision and then drives it, can be characterized by having, you know, what amounts to a regular strategic planning
Hmm.
practice where they are constantly looking at the vision, looking at what they're doing, and making adjustments based on what's actually happening out there in the
Hmm.
marketplace.
Hmm.
So rather than tell a story about a company, I can just share that many of my clients have put into place things like steering committees and regularly scheduled meetings, sometimes on as frequent as weekly,
Hmm.
to determine whether or not they're moving forward with their vision achievement, whether their
Hmm.
strategy is aligned with their vision, whether
Hmm.
their organization design is aligned with their vision.
Yeah.
You know, those are the ones that'll be successful. If you're
Hmm.
not doing that, chances are your vision is just going to be a piece of paper that
Correct.
gets tucked away someplace
Correct.
and
Correct.
not really
Absolutely.
used.
We've seen so many companies where visions and missions are painted outside the reception, and nobody seems to even recall what they are.
Yeah,
But
right, absolutely.
my my next question for you, Jim, is how can leaders adapt their vision in an incredibly fast changing business environment, and now more so with the change that's happening in the future of work and technology?
Yeah, I think what's critical there is as soon as the vision story is created
Hmm.
and institutionalized, brought forward so everyone understands it, then you've got to make sure that you're putting the action pieces in place. And
Hmm.
that translates into projects and programs that will help you move the organization from where it is today to where you want to bring it. And then you monitor each of those initiatives to see how they're doing. Are they achieving the objectives? And that's how you monitor. You're really monitoring at the micro level, where a vision is more at the macro level. But
Hmm.
it's through execution that you actually move from point A to point B. And that's
Hmm.
what you monitor. That's what you adjust.
Well said. Thank you. Let's now talk about company culture tips. And culture is often defined as the way that we do things here. Um, I don't know what your definition of culture is, but you talk about creating a culture of decency and integrity.
Hmm.
What are some of the practical ways to embed these values into a company's culture?
A leadership team has to walk the talk.
Hmm.
It's one thing to say, oh, we're going to be about our people,
Hmm.
or we're going to be about, delivering exceptional service to our customers, etc. But if you're not putting resources behind it, if you're not acting in ways that show that you're putting your people first or that you care about the customer experience, then that's just talk. So the best way to actually change culture is to ensure that you're behaving in ways that are consistent with what you're trying to bring forward in the company. And a real quick definition of culture, culture is simply the way people behave.
Right.
So at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. And as top leaders, we've got to make sure we're behaving in ways that people can follow,
Hmm.
where that we're setting the example.
Hmm. And Jim, what would your perspective be on a leader's mindset and the influence of the leader's mindset on the overall culture of his or her organization?
Yeah, tip number two in the book, and this is under leadership mindset,
Yeah.
right, is leadership's about them, not you.
Hmm.
And what that means is, it's not your ego trip. Being a leader isn't about making you feel good. It's about inspiring people to do their best,
Hmm.
right? So back to the question about culture, you absolutely have to adopt that mindset. You're
Hmm.
leading other people and you have to give them what they need to
Hmm.
behave in the ways that you want,
Hmm.
the company to operate. And that's a mindset decision that you're making every day.
Hmm. And I've often been confronted with situations where, and this is the world of startups, a founder often says that, I expect people to behave like this, but I'm the owner, I'm the founder, and I'm not expected to do that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
what advice would you have for leaders or founders who are looking to build a culture that creates innovation and creativity?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of different things. We can tie it back to the comment or the question about, how do you become more self-aware? And as you recall, you need a coach. So I would say even a startup leader should have some coaching
Hmm.
to help remind them that they're setting the example, that they're behaving in the way they're telling their folks to behave, and so
Hmm.
on. As far as introducing innovation, and creativity, I think it's about being open to those things. It's
Hmm.
about letting people bring their best ideas to the table
Hmm.
and take those ideas. It doesn't have to be invented by the top leader. And the more we engage and the more we encourage people to openly offer their best thinking, the stronger and more creative and more innovative our companies become.
Hmm. Great response. Let's now talk about your fourth segment, which is trust and empowerment tips. Can you explain for my viewers and listeners the connection between trust and empowerment?
Sure. In order to develop the people around you, they've got to trust you. So it begins there. It's about building trust and having people believe that you've got their best interests at heart. And then in regard to empowerment, you really have to develop people to a point where they can be empowered,
Hmm.
you know? Um, so it's making that commitment to get your people to the right level of proficiency and
Hmm.
then letting them go and do their job and not
Right.
and not micromanaging
Hmm. Hmm.
everything they do.
Yeah, well said. And why is trust considered a foundational element of effective leadership? And how can leaders build it within their teams?
Yeah, great question. The bottom line is we're not going to get the level of commitment required to do incredible things without people trusting their leaders.
Hmm.
So it's absolutely critical that we do that. And I think it begins with transparency, with authenticity, with fairness. It's all those things. That's why I'm promoting the concept of decency and integrity. I think to a large extent, some of those basic values have been lost, and maybe it's because there's so much emphasis on profitability and so on. But I contend that you can still be decent and have high integrity and still have a highly profitable business.
Right,
So,
right.
so let's not
Okay.
lose fit,
Mhm.
lose track of the basics.
Absolutely right. And in the context of leadership, how do you differentiate between trust building and trust maintenance?
Yeah, the trust building, I think it happens in a couple of different places. You can almost put it on a timeline. At the beginning, when you're building a team around you, you're in a trust building phase. And if you ever do anything in your behavior, in your actions that loses trust, then you're back in that trust building phase. And you're almost not only starting from zero, you might be starting, behind behind zero
Yeah,
to rebuild trust. Because I think once people lose trust in someone, it takes an awful lot of effort to regain that trust.
correct.
Trust maintenance, is really about continuing to be authentic and transparent and
Hmm.
decent and keep your promises and all those things. So that's how we maintain trust once it's established.
Fascinating. Let's now talk about change management tips. Um, how can, well, before I ask you the question, how do you define change management? And is this different from transformation?
Uh, that's a really great question. I guess I never thought about it. Probably because I don't make a big distinction between the two.
Okay.
I do think that you've got to change in order to transform.
Mm,
So maybe there's levels of, degrees of change.
mm,
The ultimate change is true transformation. Maybe if we think of it that way,
yeah.
that could be a healthy model.
Mm,
But yeah, I think in my work, I tend to use those things interchangeably. My goal is always to transform.
well said. But as human beings, and I've seen this throughout my career, most of us as human beings like status quo or status quo ante. How can leaders ensure their teams stay motivated and engaged during periods of significant change?
Okay, I'm going to get to that question, Ashutosh, but I'm going to just make a clarifying statement.
Mm,
I
mm,
think people love change.
yeah.
They
Okay.
just don't like the process of change.
Okay. I stand corrected. Absolutely. I agree.
I really do. I think we like
Mm,
variety and all that stuff, but sometimes we just don't like the effort that it takes to
yeah.
get to where we want
Yeah.
to go. As far as getting people motivated, I think the biggest thing, and I call it the greatest tool in our toolkit,
Mm,
is awareness. If we can help people recognize that there's something in it for them, then they're going to help make the change happen. As long as that motivation is there, they're going to help.
mm,
And I also feel that, part of that is, and it's another tip in the book, use the why.
mm,
Explain why this change has to occur.
right.
And I think if you do those things, then you are improving your chances of making the change,
Mm,
actually work.
yep. Well said. And how can leaders communicate change effectively across different levels? Because when I was growing up as a young management uh, person in a large company, it was always based on, we will tell you based on a need to know basis.
Yeah.
So, how can leaders communicate change effectively?
Yeah, I do think, and you hit the nail on the head, Ashutosh, it's got to be at all levels of the organization. We've
Right.
got to we've got to communicate it from the top down to the bottom up, from the
Hmm.
inside out. Um, and I think it has to be a consistent message as well. So if we're saying something at the top, we've got to make sure our middle layer of the organization understands it and translates it into something that can be, implemented. And then I think at the lower level, at the supervisory layer of a company, if you will, we've got to be able to translate that into action
Hmm.
so that there's people actually doing the work that's required to achieve that vision that's been articulated from the top. So it happens at all three levels. The leadership team in all three levels
Hmm.
need to communicate it and walk the talk as we've already discussed today.
Wonderful. And my last question to you, relating to change management tips. What do you recommend for leaders to overcome resistance to change?
Yeah, again, it starts with that messaging. You've got to help people see that there's something in it for them, that we're going to make this better in some way. And when we do, it will be better for them too. That's really, really important. People have to see their own success, their own well-being in the changes that you're trying to promote from the top.
Amazing. And on that note, Jim, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. When I started to prepare for my conversation with you, I was trying to decide what should I ask you because, you got 101 tips. And I said, either I can get into details or I can give my viewers and listeners what I would call a tasting menu of your 101 tips, which we managed to cover 15 of those, 15 points, and you added some very interesting perspectives. Thank you for speaking to me about five of the six tips. We were not able to cover the people aspect, but I think we did cover people across all the other five tips as well. All the very best for your book. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It's been great spending some time with you. And I really enjoyed the conversation. Had some great questions
Thank,
today and enjoyed the exchange.
thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.